Welcome, everybody, to Freelance Writing Direct. I'm your host, Estelle Erasmus, the author of Writing That Gets Noticed, Find Your Voice, Become a Better Storyteller, Get Published, and it is now a course at NYU and an elective towards the journalism certificate. Every week, I speak with novelists, with authors, with writers of every niche to talk about their tips, their tricks, their strategies, and how the sauce is made, including creative advice. I'll talk about essays and articles and share my own experience from 3 decades of publishing. So join me every week and grow your business and build your craft with Freelance Writing Direct. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes, and follow along on Substack, where I share special clips for subscribers only at estelleserasmus.substack.com. Welcome, everybody, to this episode of Freelance Writing Direct. And I am so excited to have as my guest Mimi Zieman, MD. And she wrote this fantastic book, Tap Dancing on Everest, A Young Doctor's Unlikely Adventure. And it's a memoir. So I want to tell you a little bit about Mimi before we begin. Mimi is a writer, physician, and speaker with a new memoir, Tap Dancing on Everest, about the risks we take to become our truest selves. She's written a play, The Post-Roe Monologues, that has been performed in multiple cities and has co-authored 16 editions of a medical guide, Managing Contraception. Her writing has appeared in Newsweek, The Sun magazine, Ms. magazine, The Forward, NBC News THINK, and other publications. She did her OBGYN training at Columbia University and is an advocate for reproductive rights, having served as Director of Family Planning, Emory University School of Medicine, Chief Medical Officer, Planned Parenthood Southeast, and as an advisor to the CDC working on contraceptive guidelines. Her newsletter provides medical news along with inspiration from art and nature. And you could learn more at her website, MIMIZIEMANMD.com. And I'm going to have that all in the show notes. Mimi, it's so great to have you here today. And I'm so excited to be talking about your memoir with you. And we met years ago. I think it was during the pandemic when I taught writing midlife and beyond for NYU online.
Yes. First of all, I'm delighted to be here. And yes, I took your essay class during the pandemic.
First of all, knowing that you're a former student of mine and that you wrote this memoir, it's so inspiring, number one. Number two, you have so many themes in it that I can relate to. I'm the daughter of a Holocaust survivor. My mom was a baby during the war, and there are just so many themes. So let's talk about the genesis of this book, right? So how did you decide? I mean, you were a storied physician with a guide to contraception that's been copied and produced in different editions all over the world. So how did you get from there to this?
Well, I always wanted to write this story. And I rediscovered this when I looked at journals writing the book, is how much I actually wanted to be a writer. My journals are filled with poetry and stories and recording all my observations, which is the material I used to write the book. So it wasn't completely out of the blue, but I really did shelve this story away for decades. And there was a point around 2015 where I took my Everest journal out and transcribed the whole thing into a computer file, but then put it away for another several years. And basically, very unplanned, I resigned from one job and then following morning sat down and just started writing this book. And that was 5 years ago. And I've sort of immersed myself in writing to get this done, taking so many classes and studying the craft, including your class, and just worked really hard to finally get this story out.
Well, what I love, and I've seen so many memoirs, is that your memoir takes a window into the past, but you do it in such an adept way. So I've seen so many memoirs that go, and I remember, or I had a flashback, or I started thinking of. And you actually, like, it isn't clunky. For example, the first real mention of your past comes in on page 12, and you write, as I shoved my gear into the duffels, I didn't think about the weight my past added to my load. Tracing my journey now, the dashed lines connecting these extremes, my family's background, and Everest come into focus. I mean, what a beautiful transition. Your next part says, there's a break, just a page break, and it says, Mom rolled her stockings. And there you go into a memory. I mean, how did you do this over and over again? As someone who's working on my own memoir of being a magazine editor in chief, a single magazine editor in chief during the glory days of print magazines in the 90s, and also the dating diva, I was really paying attention to these craft techniques that you use. So, how did you do this over and over again?
Well, it's funny because you just mentioned what I go through ever since I started writing. I can't read anything without analyzing the craft as I'm reading. And in a way, it disappoints me because I just want to be lost in the story, but I'm constantly looking at how they do everything. It was a lot of work to try to figure that out. And as you know, with writing, you get so much conflicting advice. So, first of all, I got the advice, don't go too chronological, or no one wants to hear too much about your family or backstory, or don't go be too autobiographical. So that weighs heavy on you because you want to listen to that and you don't want to bore the reader. And then I've also, gotten the advice not to jump too much back and forth in time or to confuse the reader. So, for example, that passage, it took a lot of trial and error to figure out. I knew that at one point in my book, it became very propulsive and would be fairly straight chronologically. But the early part of my book, which involves more of the family part, I had to think about those things I just said that I wanted to be really careful about. And so that chapter, for example, I kind of frame around the body. And the body is sort of a theme in the whole book. So when Mom rolls up her stockings, it transitions also into a thematic theme for that chapter that allows me to, I think, go back and forth a little in time. Some thematic, a lot of flashback then, and then some straight chronological.
Yeah, there's so much to talk about with your book because it's an adventure story in the way of wild, and Cheryl Strayed's been a guest on my program. And it's also a very deeply woven story with themes of intergenerational trauma, of the idea of taking up space and of the vastness of the mountain and the freedom and your own issues that you had with your body, and you're finding freedom in movement. And even the title, Tap Dancing on Everest, and how wonderful that you have this photo of yourself, with your tap shoes and your outfit. And you describe that really clearly in the book. And so it's a book with a lot of depth to it and a lot of through lines. And as a magazine editor, I'm always looking for those through lines, and I teach my students, in the essays to put it in. But I think it's even harder to get it going from the beginning to the end with the memoir. And you do that so adeptly in all these different ways that you also tie up at the end. So the intergenerational trauma of your dad and what he reveals to you about his family, very early on in the book, and then how that kind of affected your feeling of, can you connect with someone else? Can you go to someone for help and all that? And how you ended up being helpful. And there's so much that you put in. Was there any threads or through lines that you wanted to put in and thought about it, or maybe were advised not to put in? Or how did you focus on those specific ones?
Such a good question. So I got so much advice. I got only write an Everest book. your family is a separate book. You can't put them together. I wanted to put it together. So I had to figure out through the writing process, which is something I didn't know 5 years ago, that writing itself helps you discover through lines and how to do it. Once I realized it was a coming of age story, that's how I could weave everything together, that the overarching through line is finding my way to becoming my own person, not what the world was telling me to be. And that on this path, I had to take risks, try new things, follow my passions, be open to opportunities, and consider them as possibilities. And that I had to overcome the obstacles of fear and self doubt. So that is how I framed the whole book. And so then everything I looked at, how to serve that narrative, there was a lot of cut out. So one of the things I did, I don't know if you've read Stuart Horowitz's book Architecture. There's a lot of different advice on how to do this. So I used his to take every possible vignette and analyze it for what it was about, what themes were at play, did it move the story forward, or should it be cut? And then I had all these themes, like you mentioned, body, confinement versus freedom, dance, shame and self-doubt, vulnerability, fear. And I would look at each scene and see if it served that purpose. And then, they also say, especially a debut memoir, you got to get it under 80,000 words. So I think I was at about 76,000. I don't know. So there was a lot of pruning. I probably wrote twice as much as what's in the book.
And how did you decide on the title for the book? Because you originally had a different title, I think you said.
Yeah, I had two different original titles. The first, I still like my other titles. The first was Less Wise. And I like that because I'll tell you, it's based on a quote, but I also like it because memoirs are about getting wise. And so Less Wise was kind of cute. But it's based on a quote of George Mallory, a famous British explorer, who, when he saw the east face of Mount Everest, which is where we went and where almost nobody goes, he said, "Other men less wise might attempt this way if they would, but it was emphatically not for us." And that was kind of a team motto. So Less Wise was a title. And then my next title was Unguided.
I like
Uh,
that actually.
I
Yeah.
like Unguided too. There are a lot of one word titles like that. And that played on the fact that as a child, I felt unguided,
Right.
because my parents were immigrants and busy building their own lives. And our team was unguided. Our
Right.
Everest team, we had no Sherpa support, no oxygen. I chose tap dancing just because it was catchy.
It is catchy and it ties in that idea of movement and
Yeah.
dance and body. So I think, and it works great with the picture. I mean, the fact that you have a photo from those days, that's
Yeah.
what brings it to life. And you have more than one photo because there was
And
a photographer there.
and dancing is a very big through line. It's in the chapter that you mentioned right at the beginning of the book, and it's the final image. And so it is a very honest,
Yeah.
you know, relationship to the story. Yeah.
So you don't shy away, in this fraught, crazy climate, which is very difficult for Jewish people. You don't shy away with talking about themes of anti-Semitism from your dad and your mom and what they dealt with to a pivotal moment that I'm not going to give away that helped you decide what kind of a doctor you want to be. How is that choice made? And particularly in today's climate where it is difficult to even proudly talk about your background.
Yeah. Well, of course, the climate's gotten much worse over the last 6 months. So it was less of a risky decision. But it was really important to me once I started writing to have it include Judaism. It's such a strong part of my background, my identity. Being the daughter of a Holocaust survivor, I wanted to contribute to the literature of children of survivors with a very different story. Not many or any story of someone in that family structure going to a Everest climb, just to contribute to the range of Jewish literature. but also because these people I grew up with, my parents and all their friends who were survivors, were really outsized personalities to me. And I wanted to capture that on the page and how confusing it was as a child, seeing them and what they had been through. And how did that relate to me as an American? As I say, at one point, eating cereal and watching cartoons. And yeah, of course, it's so sad that just being Jewish right nowadays could get me canceled.
I love that you have the scenario of having a Seder during Passover on Mount Everest with looked like non-Jewish team members, which I don't know if that could even happen today, sadly, but that's an amazing visual moment that you have put in there, which is wonderful.
It was such a spontaneous moment, which most of my story things happen kind of spontaneously, right? I'll
Right.
get an idea. And yeah, that day I just looked up and it was a full moon. And I was like, oh my God, it's Passover. I got to do a Seder. And yes, I was the only Jewish person. The guys loved it. I mean, it really brought us closer because they got to see a part of me and we made it our own. They talked about their experiences the way you would in a Seder, you know.
Right. That's beautiful. And the way that you broke down the book, right? So you have it's 5 parts, and you have searching, then you have the Versailles, which is kind of getting to that point of where you're gonna decide to go on it. Vastness, which is, I guess, exploring this mountain-seeking part of your personality and going on it, returning, and then to surrender, which has the most chapters in it. How did you decide to call those chapters each title that you gave them?
Mostly based on what those parts of the book were. So the Versailles was the name of the apartment building I grew up in, and I liken it to feeling confined as you do in a city and as you do in a decrepit building that I grew up in that was ironically called the Versailles. And vastness was me being introduced to the Himalayas when I backpacked solo in Nepal. And it had to do with opening myself up, from a shy, hidden child into becoming, trying to figure out who I wanted to be as a woman. Then returning, because there's a quote that I just really love. I use as an epigraph from Renee Damal that has to do with you can't always stay on the summits. You have to return. So, what's the point? Pay attention to what you see on the way up. I'm not quoting it exactly. And that becomes important in your life after. And I returned to start medical school, which was another confining experience for me. And so, how do you deal with that in your life? And then, the expedition, just
The
learning to surrender to life. Surrender is, it's a concept I get from yoga and, my yoga teaching and just important life lesson. And it meshes with what some of what we experienced on the mountain.
I wanted to talk about, like, you start right in the action. You start that moment that you're on the glacier. So it's really kind of like the inciting incident because we're not having any preamble, we're not having any throat clearing, we're not even starting with a flashback or anything like that. It's like here you are in this moment and something's happening. And then we go back to learning about you, which I think was a great choice because otherwise we don't really know enough about you. And then later, much later in the book, is when you get the invitation, when we've worked up to learning about the invitation and we learn the real kind of logistics of what's happening out there on the mountain. But by then, we care as the reader, we care about you. And we also care about the people that there are potential issues with who are in your team. So, how was that decision made to just start right there?
So I first got the idea in one of my early memoir writing classes. Maybe try to start with a moment of drama. And for me, the drama, and part of why I wanted to write this story of the mountaineering was that I was not the climber, I was not the mountaineer, but I felt like I had this important experience. And I thought maybe other people could relate to someone more in the background. But then I end up going through this horrific thing of my teammates disappearing, which for me, was reaching my lowest moments of despair. So that's where I start. And I think it's called an E structure when you start at something dramatic and then you work away back around to it and come back to it. And there are some tricky things with that structure, but I did it for the reason you said. And part of why I wanted to have those early years is to develop the character of me so that you would understand her and where she is and what she's going through and what she's carrying on her shoulders. So it was exactly for that reason. And it was the moment of tension and drama that I hoped would invite the reader in.
I think it's really effective. So we talked about the through line of maps, right? Maps is a really big thing. It's kind of like finding your place in the world and describing the world. And of course, the other side of the world is where Tibet. And you talk about at the end, you have a really big transformation. It's a transformation in going through what you went through, feeling differently about yourself, and you pull in these disparate threads, even to the point where you talk about Amama, your grandmother, and your beloved grandmother, and you called when she would kind of act out or act overly brave, and how you kind of did a similar thing. And I love that because it's really like I could see this book easily being made into a movie. And it's one of these movie moments where you could see the person kind of becoming who she is, but having all the past influences kind of come together. And do you feel like you carry a mama with you now?
So much so, as you say, she was so beloved to me, even though I lost her very young, which really speaks to the way our parents and grandparents and other important figures stay with us and influence us. I mean, how long I haven't had her, but yeah, pulling in my family meant just having a big loud voice and not caring what anybody thought about you when you did that. So, yeah, it was my way of also honoring her, someone I loved so much and, had for a very short time.
Mimi, there's something I want to point out to everyone about this book. It is so beautifully written. It's not just an adventure story and a coming of age, which it is all of that, but you have so many beautiful lines and metaphors and phrases throughout the book, which makes it literary as well, which is a very difficult feat when you're writing memoir. And it's usually, from what I've seen, achieved more in memoir and essays, but you have achieved it here. For example, on page 36, you say, when talking about the Catskills, here wilderness replaced wildness, adventure replaced adversity. And that is such a great summary of this immigrant experience. I mean, my grandparents used to get bungalows out in the Catskills too, and we'd come and visit them. And so tell me about these choices of wording and how you did it. Did you write it as you went along? Did you go back and sort of fine tool it in your drafts? How did that work?
First of all, it like touches me enormously that you appreciate that in my writing. That's the part of writing I love, like the sentence level and word level. And I could get lost in that forever. I did write poetry, probably was bad as a young person, but it was in my journals there as an inspiration. I love the rhythm and the sound of words. So I love alliteration. I love all those techniques that are sentence level. Some of them have words I can't even remember or pronounce, but I did a lot of editing. If you say no, things didn't come out like right away, but varying, having a long sentence and then short sentences and just listening to I just love the rhythm. I love words. You speak other languages. I part of what I talk about is influence of my parents' foreign languages. And that gave me such an appreciation for words and communicating from a young age. So Yeah, I mean, that's my heart. I love that in the writing.
And you also, as a physician, or maybe it's somebody who's used to using technical language, you were very precise in describing the medical ailments people dealt with up there on the mountain, also your own scatological situations, which I was a little surprised, but I was like, okay, I think she's showing her bodily functions as part of the story because she wants to make it natural or something like that.
Mhm.
Plus, you employed so many different, as I talked about the metaphor, the other things, you had like the glacier talking to you, like a kind of an esoteric experience here. So, how did that all come together? And I do feel that it's because you're a physician that you're able to be so precise with the language of describing the medical situations people were going through and also the actual like specific, almost like John Krakauer did in his book about climbing Everest, putting in the specifics of these climbs. How did that all come together, these very precise use of language?
Yeah, well, you're right. Precision in medical probably comes because I did, have a whole career of medical writing. And even I was a medical editor for 12 years. So I'm aware of that, trying to be concise. It's much easier for me to write something medical than write something like this, you know? And I also cut a lot. You talk about mountaineering history. I had a whole chapter on what it means to do a first climb, because our team was attempting a first route. I cut a lot of some medical backstory. I did include the perils of high altitude and what that means to live with low oxygen levels, hypoxemia, hypoxia. But yeah, those are all choices how to balance. You know, went through so many drafts of cutting, including cutting.
And what about your own issues with period and diarrhea? It was a lot.
It was. I did it for exactly what you said. I'm like, if I as a doctor and as a gynecologist can't talk about changing tampons in the snow or, my near death diarrhea, like who can? But
Yeah.
yet we all go through it. So again, we write to try to capture a universal experience and have other people relate to it. And yeah, some people have read it was like, oh my God, I had something just like that. And so that's the reason I did it.
Less people think this is just an adventure story and a story about upbringing. You talk about romantic relationships, including with people there on the mountain. And I think it's really another thread, showing your evolution. We don't get to the point where you talk in depth about your husband of decades, but we can kind of see this transition in you and finding again, what's important to you in terms of relationship. And you even mention at one point something about that you have to be able to read in a room with someone. And I love that. I think that's a great tool because somebody once said to me, you have to be comfortable with someone in these silences. And that reminded me of that. There's so much wonderful material in the book. It's such a great read. I'm so thrilled that it's out in the world. What do you want people to most take away from your book, Mimi?
Thank you for first of all for everything, Estelle. Really, it's so kind of you. I think that people have passions, things they might want to pursue, adventures, and they're often held back by fear, self-doubt, fear of taking risks. So I hope when they read my story, they see how I grappled with that. I think I'm honest about that. And nothing about it was easy. Nothing about writing this book was easy. But I think if we push through the hard things, we grow. We don't necessarily achieve success but you can't not grow when you're taking risk and you're stretching yourself. And people, every day we have these kind of decisions. Do I leave this job that's secure, but I'm not happy? I went through that. And I really grappled with that a few times in my career. And then I took the risk and left. And usually the next thing it works out better. But I don't know. I just I think that's the main takeaway.
Yes, for anybody who feels constrained by the shoulds that they've always been told in
Yeah.
their lives, from whatever it is, from religion, from past, from upbringing, from society today, it's important to feel that you have that way of finding freedom in a different way. Thank you so much. This has been wonderful.
Thank you, Estelle. It's a real honor to get to talk to you, and you just got my books so well, and that means the world to me. So thank you.
Follow me at estelleserasmus.com on my website and on social media, which is Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter at Estelle S. Erasmus. And we're now on YouTube for Freelance Writing Direct. Follow along, and soon everyone will be reading what you're writing.